Now that your husband is dead, grieve, pack your bags, and never come back, my daughter-in-law said at dinner. My son just smiled and nodded. The house was never really yours anyway. I moved out without a word. The next day, I went to the bank and, I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached. The dining room felt different without Noel's presence. The mahogany table that had hosted countless family dinners now seemed too large, too empty, despite the three of us sitting around it. I kept glancing at his empty chair, expecting to see him there with his gentle smile and calming presence. It had been exactly 1 week since we buried my husband of 32 years. 1 week since I'd stood at his graveside, feeling like half of my soul had been ripped away. The grief still sat heavy in my chest, making every breath feel labored. "Pass the potatoes, Myrtle," Romy said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. My daughter-in-law had never used a warm tone with me, but tonight there was something different, something colder. I reached for the serving bowl, my hands still trembling slightly. The funeral had drained me more than I'd expected. At 71, I thought I'd prepared myself for this day, but nothing could have prepared me for the hollow ache that followed me everywhere now. Wade, my 43-year-old son, sat between us like a referee who'd already chosen sides. He'd barely looked at me all evening, his attention focused entirely on his wife of 15 years. The son who used to crawl into my lap when he had nightmares now couldn't even meet my eyes. The service was beautiful, wasn't it? I offered, trying to fill the uncomfortable silence. Your father would have loved seeing so many people there. Romy set down her fork with deliberate precision. Yes? Well, that's actually what we need to discuss with you, Myrtle. Something in her tone made my stomach clench. I looked between her and Wade, searching for any sign of the warmth that should exist between family members who just shared a loss. Instead, I found cold calculation in Romy's eyes, and uncomfortable avoidance in my son's. "What do you mean?" I asked, though part of me already dreaded the answer. Romy straightened in her chair, assuming the posture she used when delivering ultimatums. I'd seen it before, usually when she was explaining why Wade couldn't visit me as often, or why family traditions needed to change to accommodate her preferences. "Wade and I have been talking," she began, her voice taking on that false sweetness she used when she wanted something. "Now that Noel is gone, this house is going to be too much for you to handle alone." I blinked, confused. Too much? I've been managing this house for over 30 years. I know every creaky floorboard and temperamental faucet. Yee? That's exactly the problem, Romy continued, her mask of pleasantness slipping slightly. You're not getting any younger, and maintaining a house this size is expensive. Wade and I think it would be best if you moved somewhere more suitable. The words hit me like a physical blow. Moved. This is my home. Noel and I built our life here. Wade grew up here. Wade finally spoke, his voice barely above a mumble. "Mom, Romy's right. The upkeep alone is going to be overwhelming for you." "I'm not helpless, Wade," I said, hearing my voice crack slightly. "And this house. Your father and I saved for years to buy this place. Every room holds memories of our life together." Romy's expression hardened. "Memories don't pay utility bills or property taxes. Be practical, Myrtle." I stared at her. This woman who'd systematically pushed me out of my son's life for 15 years. The woman who'd convinced Wade that Sunday dinners with his mother were too much pressure, and that holiday visits needed to be balanced between families, which somehow always meant more time with her relatives. "What exactly are you suggesting?" I asked, though I could feel the answer forming like ice in my stomach. "We think you should look into one of those nice senior communities," Romy said, her tone suggesting she was doing me a tremendous favor. "Somewhere with activities and people your own age. It would be so much better for you than rattling around in this big empty house." I turned to Wade, desperately hoping to see some sign that he disagreed with this plan. "Wade, you really think I should sell the house where you grew up? Where your father and I—" "It makes sense, Mom," he interrupted, still not meeting my eyes. "And honestly, Romy and I could use the space. We've been talking about expanding our family, And this house has so much potential. The meaning behind his words crashed over me like a cold wave. They didn't just want me gone, they wanted my house. The home Noel and I had lovingly restored, room by room, over 3 decades. Now that the Sogro died, live your grief, pack your bags and never come back. Romy's voice suddenly lost all pretense of civility. The house was never really yours anyway. The Spanish word for father-in-law rolled off her tongue with casual cruelty, as if she was discussing disposing of old furniture instead of throwing out her husband's mother. Wade looked up then, and for a moment I saw something flicker in his eyes, uncertainty, maybe even guilt. But then he smiled and nodded. She's right, Mom. This house was Dad's. And now it's mine. You were just living here. I felt my world tilt on its axis, just living here, as if 32 years of marriage, of building a life and raising a family, amounted to nothing more than extended house-sitting. I see, I said quietly, my voice steadier than I felt. Inside, something was breaking apart, not just my heart, but my understanding of who my son was, who my family was. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady. I'll need some time to— 2 weeks, Romy cut me off. That should be plenty of time to find somewhere suitable and arrange for movers. 2 weeks. Not 2 months. Not even a reasonable timeline to grieve and plan. 2 weeks to dismantle a lifetime. Wade finally looked directly at me, and what I saw there was worse than anger or hatred. It was indifference. Complete casual indifference to my pain. It's for the best, Mom, he said, as if he was convincing himself as much as me. You'll see. I walked upstairs to the bedroom I'd shared with Noel, each step feeling like I was climbing a mountain. The room still smelled like his cologne, and his reading glasses were still on the nightstand where he'd left them the night before his heart attack. I sat on the edge of our bed and stared at my reflection in the dresser mirror. The woman looking back at me seemed older than 71, her silver hair limp and her blue eyes dulled by shock and grief. In 2 weeks, I would have to leave this room where I'd said goodbye to Noel just 7 days ago. I would have to pack up 32 years of marriage into boxes and surrender it all to a son who'd just told me I'd never really belonged here anyway. But as I sat there in the gathering darkness, something else began to stir beneath the grief and shock. A small, hard kernel of determination. Noel had always been the one who handled our finances, but he'd taught me to be thorough, to pay attention to details. Tomorrow I would start making arrangements. I would call the bank and begin the process of figuring out exactly what I was entitled to. Because if Wade and Romy thought they could just erase me from this family without consequence, they might be in for a surprise. The first thing I needed to do was understand exactly what Noel had left behind, and to whom. The morning sun felt different streaming through the kitchen windows as I sat alone at the breakfast table, nursing my second cup of coffee. 10 days had passed since that awful dinner, and the house felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for me to leave. Wade and Romy had already been by twice to assess the space, measuring rooms and discussing renovations as if I were invisible. Yesterday, I'd overheard Romy on the phone with a contractor, scheduling estimates for once the old woman moves out. I'd spent those 10 days in a strange bubble of numbness, mechanically sorting through belongings and trying to ignore the growing knot of anxiety in my stomach. But this morning, I finally felt ready to face the practical matters Noel would have expected me to handle. The drive to First National Bank took 15 minutes through the familiar streets of our neighborhood. I'd been making this same drive for over 20 years, usually with Noel in the passenger seat handling our banking business while I waited in the car. He'd always been protective of our finances, not because he didn't trust me, but because he said it was one less thing for me to worry about. Now I wished I'd paid more attention. Mrs. Patterson, the bank manager, greeted me with the careful sympathy reserved for recent widows. "Mrs. Henderson, I was so sorry to hear about Noel. He was such a gentleman, always asking about my grandchildren." "Thank you, Helen. He spoke fondly of you too." I settled into the chair across from her desk, my purse clutched tightly in my lap. "I need to understand my financial situation. Noel handled everything, and I'm afraid I'm rather lost. Helen's expression softened with understanding. Of course. Let me pull up your accounts. She turned to her computer, fingers clicking across the keyboard. After a moment, her eyebrows rose slightly. Oh my, is something wrong? My heart jumped. Had Wade and Romy somehow already gained access to our accounts? Not wrong exactly, it's just, there are quite a few accounts here. More than I was expecting. Helen's voice held a note of surprise. Let me start with the joint checking account you and Noel used for household expenses. She printed out a statement and slid it across the desk. The balance was modest but comfortable, enough to cover my expenses for several months if I was careful. Relief flooded through me. At least I wouldn't be destitute. Now, Helen continued, there's also a savings account in both your names. Another sheet of paper appeared. This balance was significantly larger, enough to sustain me for years if necessary. That's wonderful, I said, feeling some of the tension leave my shoulders. Noel was always careful about saving. Yes, he was very methodical, Helen agreed, but she was still frowning at her screen. Mrs. Henderson, I'm seeing several other accounts here that I need to verify. Some appear to be in your name only. When was the last time you reviewed your complete financial portfolio with Noel? My name only? I echoed, confused. That doesn't sound right. Noel managed all our finances. Helen's fingers flew over the keyboard again. According to our records, there are 4 additional accounts, 2 CDs, a money market account, and, this is interesting, a trust account that was established 5 years ago. My head began to spin. I don't understand. Noel never mentioned any of this to me. May I ask, did your husband ever express concerns about your family situation? Sometimes clients establish separate accounts as a form of protection. The question caught me off guard. Protection? From what? I'm not sure what you mean. Helen hesitated, clearly choosing her words carefully. Sometimes when clients have complex family dynamics, perhaps concerns about inheritance disputes or external pressures, they take steps to ensure their spouse's financial security. I thought about Noel's behavior over the past few years. How he'd started asking pointed questions about Romy's spending habits. How he'd grown quiet whenever Wade mentioned their financial struggles. How he'd insisted on handling all our banking personally, never allowing Wade to accompany him even when our son offered. Can you tell me about these other accounts? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Helen printed several more pages. The first CD has been rolling over annually for 7 years. The second was opened 3 years ago. The money market account has been receiving automatic transfers from your joint checking account. Small amounts, $50 here and there, but over time. She handed me the statements. The numbers swam in front of my eyes. These weren't modest emergency funds. These were substantial amounts of money, enough to buy a house, enough to live comfortably for decades. How is this possible? I asked. I never signed anything. I never. Actually, you did, Helen said gently, pulling out a file folder. Your signatures are on all the paperwork. It appears Noel brought you in to sign documents, probably telling you they were routine banking updates or insurance forms. I stared at the papers she showed me. There was my signature, dated and witnessed, on forms I didn't remember signing. But looking at the dates, I could place some of them. The day we'd come in to update our address after the house numbers changed. The time we'd switched to a new type of checking account. He never told me what I was really signing, I whispered. It's not uncommon, Helen said carefully. Some spouses prefer to handle the details to avoid causing stress or confusion, and legally, everything is above board. These accounts are legitimately yours. I tried to process what this meant. While Wade and Romy were measuring my kitchen and planning their renovations, while they were treating me like a burden to be disposed of, I had resources they knew nothing about. There's one more thing, Helen said, her voice even more cautious now. The trust account I mentioned? It's been receiving transfers from a business account for the past 5 years. The Henderson Construction Trust. I believe that was your husband's company? Yes, but Noel sold the business when he retired. Wade said the money from the sale was barely enough to pay off debts. Helen consulted her screen again. According to our records, the business account is still active. There have been regular deposits and then transfers to your trust account. Mrs. Henderson, I think you need to speak with the business accountant. There may be more to your financial picture than you realize. I left the bank in a daze, my purse heavy with account statements and printouts. Instead of driving straight home, I pulled into the parking lot of a small cafe and sat in my car, reading through everything Helen had given me. The numbers didn't lie. Somehow, without my knowledge, Noel had been systematically protecting me. Every account, every investment, every trust fund was structured to ensure I would be financially independent. As I studied the trust account statements, a pattern emerged. The deposits corresponded with Wade's visits over the past 5 years, always larger amounts after Wade had asked his father for small loans, or when Romy had hinted about their financial struggles. Noel had been giving our son money, but he'd been protecting an equal or greater amount for me. As if he'd known that someday, I might need to stand on my own. My phone buzzed with a text from Wade. "Mom, Romy found a realtor to list the house. We can start showing it next week. Hope you're making progress on finding a place." I stared at the message for a long moment, then looked again at the bank statements in my lap. Wade and Romy were so confident, so certain they held all the cards. They had no idea that their careful plans were built on a foundation they didn't understand. Tomorrow, I would call the business accountant. I would find out exactly what else Noel had left behind. And then I would decide what to do with the knowledge that my husband had loved me enough to ensure I'd never be at anyone's mercy. The grief was still there, as fresh and sharp as ever. But underneath it, something else was growing. A quiet strength I hadn't felt in years. The accounting office of Morrison & Associates sat in a modest strip mall between a dry cleaner and a tax preparation service. I'd never been here before. Noel had always handled the business meetings himself, claiming it was boring paperwork that would only give me a headache. Now I understood he'd been protecting me from more than just tedium. Margaret Morrison looked to be about my age, with steel-gray hair pulled back in a practical bun and kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. She'd been handling Henderson Construction's books for over 15 years, and her expression when I'd called yesterday had been carefully neutral. "Mrs. Henderson," she said, gesturing to a chair across from her cluttered desk. "First, let me offer my condolences. Noel was a good man and an honest businessman. I'm going to miss our quarterly meetings. Thank you. I wish I could say I knew him as well in business as you did." I settled into the chair, my new bank statements tucked safely in my purse. "I'm trying to understand our financial situation, and the bank mentioned ongoing business income that I wasn't aware of." Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly. "You weren't aware? That's unusual. Noel spoke about you often, and I assumed." She trailed off, seeming to reconsider her words. "Please, I need to understand what's been happening. My son tells me the business was sold years ago and barely covered its debts." "Sold?" Margaret looked genuinely confused. "Mrs. Henderson. Henderson Construction wasn't sold. It was restructured." She turned to her computer, pulling up files. 5 years ago, Noel transferred ownership of the company assets into a trust, the Henderson Construction Trust. You're listed as the primary beneficiary. The room seemed to tilt slightly. "I'm the owner of the construction company? Well, the trust owns it, and you own the trust. It's been quite successful, actually. Your husband was very careful about the contracts he accepted after the restructuring. Smaller jobs, reliable clients, steady income rather than the boom and bust cycle of larger commercial projects." She printed out several pages and handed them to me. "These are the profit and loss statements for the past 5 years. As you can see, the company has been generating consistent revenue." I stared at the numbers, my hands trembling slightly. The annual profits were substantial, more than enough to explain the regular deposits I'd seen in the trust account statements. "But Noel retired," I said weakly. "He wasn't working anymore." "He stepped back from the day-to-day operations, yes, but he maintained oversight and handled the larger strategic decisions. The actual construction work has been managed by Tom Bradley. I believe you know him?" I nodded. Tom had worked for Noel for over 20 years, starting as a young apprentice and working his way up to foreman. He'd been at the funeral, one of the few people there who'd seemed genuinely grief-stricken. Tom has been essentially running the company for the past 5 years, Margaret continued. Noel structured it so that Tom receives a percentage of the profits as a performance bonus, which has kept him motivated and loyal. It's been a very successful arrangement. Why didn't Noel tell me any of this? The question came out as barely a whisper. Margaret hesitated, clearly uncomfortable. Mrs. Henderson, this might not be my place to say, but Noel was concerned about family pressures. He mentioned that your son had been struggling financially, and that his wife had expensive tastes. Noel worried that if the family knew about the continued business income, there would be expectations and demands that might compromise your future security. The pieces were falling into place with devastating clarity. Every time Wade had asked his father for a loan, every time Romy had made comments about how comfortable we seemed, Noel had been calculating how to help our son without sacrificing my future independence. He was protecting me, I said, the words heavy with realization. He was protecting both of you in different ways, Margaret said gently. The loans he made to Wade over the years were substantial, but they came from the business operating account, not from your personal assets, and he was very careful to document everything properly. She pulled out another file folder. These are copies of all the loan agreements between the business and your son. Noel insisted on treating them as formal business transactions, with payment schedules and interest rates. I opened the folder with shaking hands. Page after page of loan documents, each one signed by both Noel and Wade. The amounts were staggering, tens of thousands of dollars over the past 5 years, supposedly for Wade's various business ventures and investments. Has Wade been making payments on these loans? I asked, though I already suspected the answer. Margaret's expression grew uncomfortable. The payment schedule shows significant arrears. As of last month, the outstanding balance with accumulated interest is approximately $87,000. The number hit me like a physical blow. Wade owed the family business, my business, nearly $90,000, while simultaneously claiming his father had left nothing but debts. What happens to these loan obligations now? I asked. They transfer with the business assets. As the new owner of the trust, you have the legal right to demand payment or restructure the terms as you see fit. I thought about Wade and Romy measuring my kitchen, planning their renovations, discussing when they could start showing the house. They were so confident, so certain they deserved everything Noel had built. There's one more thing you should know, Margaret said, her voice even more careful now. Last month, your son contacted me directly. He said that with his father's passing, he'd be taking over management of the business affairs. He asked me to prepare a transfer of ownership documents. And? I told him I'd need written authorization from the trust beneficiary, from you. He seemed surprised that you were involved in the business structure at all. So Wade had been planning to claim the business along with the house, assuming I was too grief-stricken and naive to understand what was happening. The betrayal cut deeper than I'd thought possible. Margaret, I need to ask you something confidential, I said. If I wanted to maintain the current business structure with Tom continuing to manage operations, would that be feasible? Absolutely. Tom has been hoping to hear from you, actually. He's concerned about the company's future and his own job security. If you're willing to maintain the status quo, I think you'd find him very reliable and grateful for the opportunity to continue. I gathered up all the papers, my mind reeling with the implications of what I'd learned. The business was mine. The substantial debt Wade had accumulated was real and legally enforceable, and neither he nor Romy had any idea that their plans were built on a foundation of lies and assumptions. I'd like to schedule a meeting with Tom as soon as possible, I said. And I want to understand all of my options regarding the outstanding loans. Of course. Shall I call Tom this afternoon? Yes, please. And Margaret, I'd appreciate it if this conversation remained confidential for now. Absolutely. Client confidentiality is sacred in this business. As I drove home, my phone buzzed with another text from Romy. Myrtle, the realtor wants to schedule a photographer for tomorrow. Make sure the house is clean and decluttered. First impressions matter for potential buyers. I stared at the message for a long moment before tucking my phone away without responding. Let them plan their photography session. Let them imagine their future in my house, spending money they thought they'd inherited. They had no idea that the foundation they were building their dreams on was about to crumble beneath them. That evening, I sat in Noel's study for the first time since his death, surrounded by his carefully organized files. Now I understood why he'd been so meticulous about record-keeping, why he'd insisted on proper documentation for every transaction. He'd been building a fortress around me, brick by brick, transaction by transaction. And tomorrow, I would start learning how strong those walls really were. Tom Bradley's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee mug as we sat in my kitchen the next morning. At 55, he still had the broad shoulders and calloused palms of a man who'd spent his life building things, but his eyes held a wariness I'd never seen before. Mrs. Henderson, I gotta be honest with you, he said, his voice rough with emotion. I've been worried sick since Mr. Noel passed. Wade came by the job site last week, talking about evaluating assets and streamlining operations. It didn't sound good for folks like me. I poured myself another cup of coffee, using the familiar routine to steady my nerves. Tom, what exactly did my son tell you? He said the family was going through some financial difficulties, that tough decisions would need to be made about the business. He wanted me to give him a complete list of all our current contracts, equipment, and cash flow projections. Tom's jaw tightened. He also asked about the keys to the equipment yard and the office. And what did you tell him? That I'd need to talk to whoever was actually in charge now. Mr. Noel always told me that if anything happened to him, I should wait for proper instruction from the legal owner. Tom met my eyes. He never said it would be Wade. Relief flooded through me. Noel had prepared for this scenario, ensuring that Tom would be a guardian of the business, rather than simply handing it over to anyone who claimed authority. Tom, I need to share something with you, but I need your word that this conversation stays between us for now. His expression grew serious. You have it, ma'am. I spread out the documents Margaret had given me the day before. I own Henderson Construction. Not Wade. Not the estate. Me. Noel transferred everything into a trust 5 years ago, and I'm the beneficiary. Tom's eyes widened as he studied the papers. Well, I'll be damned. Pardon my language, ma'am, but Mr. Noel was always thinking 3 steps ahead. He was indeed, and according to these records, the business has been quite profitable under your management. A flush of pride crossed Tom's features. We've built a good reputation, Mrs. Henderson. Steady clients, quality work, fair prices. Mr. Noel taught me that repeat customers are worth more than any single big score. I want you to continue exactly as you have been, I said, but I need to understand something. Wade has been less than honest about the family's financial situation. Can you tell me about any interactions you've had with him regarding business matters? Tom's expression darkened. There have been several over the years. He'd come around when Mr. Noel wasn't there, asking about cash flow, wanting to know about upcoming payments from clients. A couple times he suggested that maybe the business could help him out with some temporary funding for investment opportunities. And what did you tell him? That he'd need to talk to his father. I'm not stupid, Mrs. Henderson. I could see what was happening. Tom's voice grew harder. Last year, he actually showed up at the bank the same day we deposited a big payment from the Morrison office building project. Just coincidence, he said. But he was mighty interested in talking to the teller about the deposit. My stomach clenched. Wade had been monitoring the business income, probably trying to time his requests for loans to coincide with maximum available cash. Tom, I want to ask you something, and I need complete honesty. Do you think Wade understands how much money has been flowing through this business? Tom was quiet for a long moment, considering. I think he knows it's more than your family let on, but I don't think he knows the full extent. Mr. Noel was very careful about keeping business and personal finances separate, at least on paper. What do you mean? Well, your husband was smart about it. When Wade would ask for help, Mr. Knoll would tell him the business was struggling, that margins were tight. But then he'd find a way to help anyway, usually as a loan from the business account rather than from his personal funds. Tom pulled out his own small notebook, worn from years of use. "I keep track of everything, Mrs. Henderson. It's a habit Mr. Knoll taught me. According to my records, Wade has received payments totaling about $93,000 over the past 5 years. The number was even higher than what Margaret had shown me. Payments? Not loans? That's what I mean about Mr. Knoll being smart. He'd structure them as loans on paper, with payment schedules and everything. But he never actually enforced the payment terms. Wade would miss a payment, and Mr. Knoll would just let it slide. So Wade thinks he owes nothing." "Wade acts like he owes nothing," Tom corrected. "Whether he really believes it or just pretends to believe it, I can't say." As if summoned by our conversation, I heard a car door slam in the driveway. Through the kitchen window, I could see Wade's Honda Pilot parked behind Tom's work truck. "That's my son," I said quietly. "I don't want him to know we've been talking about business matters." Tom nodded and quickly gathered up the papers I'd shown him. "Mrs. Henderson, whatever you decide to do, you have my full support. Mr. Knoll was a good man, and he trusted you enough to put everything in your name. That's good enough for me." Wade walked in without knocking, something that would have irritated Knoll but which I'd learned to accept over the years. "Morning, Mom," he said, barely glancing at Tom. "I wasn't expecting company." "Tom stopped by to check on me," I said smoothly. "You know how thoughtful he's always been." "Right." Wade's attention was already elsewhere, his eyes scanning the kitchen as if evaluating it for resale. "Actually, Tom, I'm glad you're here. We need to talk about the business situation." Tom's expression became carefully neutral. "Oh. With Dad gone, there are going to be some changes. The family needs to make some practical decisions about assets and ongoing obligations." I watched this exchange with fascination. Wade was so confident, so certain of his authority. He had no idea he was trying to claim something that had never belonged to him. "What kind of changes?" Tom asked. "Well, we'll need to evaluate whether it makes sense to continue operations, or if it would be better to liquidate assets and settle any outstanding debts." Wade's tone was casual, as if he were discussing what to have for lunch. "I see. And who's making these decisions?" Wade blinked, clearly not expecting the question. "The family, of course. I'll be handling Dad's business affairs going forward." "Will you now?" Tom's voice was carefully neutral, but I caught the slight emphasis on you. "Mom, you might want to make some fresh coffee," Wade said, dismissing me as he always had when important conversations were taking place. "Tom and I need to discuss some technical details," but I didn't move. For the first time in years, I stood my ground. "I'll stay, thank you. This is my kitchen, and Tom is my guest." Wade looked surprised, but shrugged. "Fine. Tom, I'll need you to prepare a complete inventory of all equipment, vehicles, and current contracts. I'll also need access to the business accounts, so I can assess the financial situation." "I'd be happy to help with that," Tom said carefully. "Who should I coordinate with regarding authorization for account access?" "With me, obviously. And you have the legal authority to access Henderson construction accounts because—" Wade's confidence wavered slightly. "Because I'm Noel Henderson's son and heir." "I see. And do you have documentation showing that you're authorized to act on behalf of the business?" The kitchen fell silent except for the ticking of the old clock above the sink. Wade's face was reddening, and I could see him struggling between irritation and uncertainty. "Look, Tom, I don't think you understand the situation here," Wade said, his voice taking on the condescending tone he used when he felt challenged. "This isn't a hostile takeover. I'm trying to clean up Dad's affairs and make sure everyone gets taken care of. But I can't do that if you're going to make things difficult." "I'm not trying to make things difficult," Tom replied evenly. "I'm just trying to understand who I'm supposed to be taking orders from. Your father was very clear about proper procedures and documentation." Wade turned to me, clearly expecting support. "Mom, explain to Tom that I'm handling Dad's business matters now." I looked at my son, this man who was planning to sell my house out from under me. who had accumulated nearly $90,000 in debt while claiming his father left nothing behind, and made my choice. Actually, Wade, I think Tom is right to ask for proper documentation, I said quietly. Your father was always very careful about these things. Wade stared at me as if I'd grown a second head. What are you talking about? I'm talking about making sure everything is handled properly and legally. Surely you can understand the importance of that. For the first time since this conversation began, Wade looked uncertain, and watching that uncertainty creep across his features, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: power. The phone call came at 7 in the morning, 3 days after my confrontation with Wade in the kitchen. I'd been expecting it. You can't question someone's assumed authority without consequences, especially when that someone is used to getting his way. Mom, we need to talk. Now. Wade's voice was tight with barely controlled anger. Romy and I are coming over. It's rather early, don't you think? This can't wait. We'll be there in 20 minutes. The line went dead before I could respond. I took my time getting dressed, choosing a navy blue dress that Noel had always said made me look dignified. If this was going to be a confrontation, I intended to face it properly. They arrived exactly 20 minutes later, Romy's heels clicking aggressively on the front porch. I opened the door before they could knock, maintaining the small advantage of being the hostess in my own home. Good morning, I said pleasantly, as if this were a social visit. Romy pushed past me into the living room, her designer purse clutched like a weapon. Wade followed, his face grim. They both remained standing, positioning themselves between me and the door in what I recognized as an intimidation tactic. Mom, I don't know what kind of game you think you're playing, Wade began. But Tom Bradley called yesterday and said he can't provide me with business information without proper authorization. What did you tell him? I settled into Noel's favorite armchair, the one with the best view of the room. I told him to follow proper procedures. Your father would have expected that. Proper procedures? Romy's voice was shrill. Wade is Noel's son and heir. What more authorization does anyone need? Legal authorization, I said calmly. The kind that comes with actual ownership. Wade's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Dad's will leaves everything to the family. I'm the executor, which means I handle all the assets until probate is settled. Actually, Wade, that's not quite accurate. I reached for the folder I'd placed on the side table, the one containing all the documents Margaret Morrison had given me. Wade and Romy both tensed as I opened it. Your father's will does indeed leave his personal possessions and this house to the family, I continued, but Henderson Construction isn't part of his estate. It hasn't been for 5 years. What are you talking about? Wade demanded. I pulled out the trust documents and set them on the coffee table between us. Henderson Construction has been owned by the Henderson Construction Trust since 2019. I am the sole beneficiary of that trust. The silence that followed was deafening. Romy reached for the documents first, her manicured fingers shaking as she scanned the legal language. Wade read over her shoulder, his face growing pale. This is impossible, Romy whispered. You don't know anything about business. You never even balanced a checkbook. You're right, I didn't. Your father handled all of that. But apparently, he understood things about our family situation that I was too naive to see. Wade sank onto the sofa as if his legs had given out. But the business was struggling. Dad always said margins were tight, that there was barely enough to keep operations running. The business has been quite profitable, actually. Here are the financial statements for the past 5 years. I handed him another set of papers. Watching Wade's face as he processed the numbers was like watching someone realize they'd been playing chess while everyone else was playing checkers. These profits. Wade's voice was barely audible. Where did this money go? Some of it went to you, Wade. Quite a lot of it, actually. I pulled out the loan documentation. $87,000 over 5 years, to be precise. Romy grabbed the loan papers, her eyes scanning frantically. These say loans. Wade, you told me those were gifts. You said your father was helping us get established. They were gifts, Wade said, but his voice lacked conviction. Dad never asked for payments. He never even mentioned payment schedules. Actually, he did, I said quietly. Margaret Morrison has copies of every conversation, every missed payment, every time your father chose to extend the terms rather than demand what you owed. I watched as the reality of their situation began to sink in. Wade had built his financial life on the assumption that his father's generosity would continue indefinitely. He'd probably borrowed against those expectations, made commitments based on money he thought was his. But this doesn't change anything, Romy said suddenly, her voice taking on a desperate edge. The house still goes to Wade. That's worth more than some little construction business. Is it? I asked mildly. Romy's eyes flashed with something between anger and panic. Don't play games, Myrtle. This house is worth at least $400,000. You're right. It's a lovely property. Of course, there is the matter of the mortgage. Wade looked up sharply. What mortgage? Dad said the house was paid off. It was. But 18 months ago, your father took out a home equity loan. Quite a substantial one, actually. I pulled out the final set of documents, the ones I'd discovered in Noel's study just yesterday, filed carefully in a folder marked Emergency Funds. A home equity loan for $350,000, I continued. The proceeds were transferred into the Henderson Construction Trust account, which means they became part of my inheritance. Romy's face went white. That's not possible. We would have known. We would have had to sign. Your father was the sole owner of the house at the time, I interrupted. I was listed as a spouse with rights of survivorship, but not as a co-owner. He didn't need anyone else's signature. Wade stared at the loan documents like they were written in a foreign language. But why would he do this? Why would he mortgage the house just to put money in a business account? For the first time since this conversation began, I allowed my carefully controlled emotions to show. Because he was protecting me, Wade. He was making sure that no matter what happened, I would have financial security. Protecting you from what? Wade's voice was hoarse. From this, I said, gesturing to the scene in front of me. From being thrown out of my own home by family members who saw me as a burden instead of a person. From being left with nothing while everyone else claimed what they thought they deserved. Romy's composure finally cracked completely. You manipulated him. You convinced a dying man to change everything. Your father wasn't dying when he set up these trusts, Romy. He was planning. And the fact that he felt the need to plan for this scenario should tell you something about how he viewed our family dynamics. Wade's hands were shaking as he set down the papers. Mom, surely we can work something out. You don't really want to run a construction business. And the house. This house is our family home. It should stay in the family. It is staying in the family, Wade. It's staying with me. But the mortgage payments, Romy said desperately. How will you afford the mortgage payments? The same way your father intended, with income from Henderson Construction. Tom Bradley assures me the business is quite stable, and Margaret Morrison says the cash flow will easily cover the loan payments with plenty left over for my living expenses. I stood up, smoothing my dress. Now, I believe you mentioned something about moving out? I think that's still an excellent idea. Not for me, of course, but I'm sure you'll find somewhere lovely to start fresh. Wade looked at me as if seeing me for the first time. Mom, you can't be serious. After everything Dad did for you, everything our family means, your father did do everything for me, I interrupted. He loved me enough to make sure I'd never be at anyone's mercy, including my own son's. And now I understand just how much I needed that protection. Romy was already at the door, her face twisted with rage and disbelief. This isn't over, Myrtle. We'll fight this. We'll contest everything. You're welcome to try, I said calmly, but you should know that everything your father did was completely legal and properly documented. Margaret Morrison is very thorough, and she's already provided copies of all relevant documents to my attorney. Wade paused at the door, his expression a mixture of confusion and hurt. I don't understand, Mom. Why are you doing this to us? I'm not doing anything to you, Wade. I'm simply refusing to let you do it to me. After they left, I sat alone in the sudden quiet of my house, and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. For the first time since I was a young woman, I was completely financially independent. I owed nothing to anyone, and no one could take away what I had. Noel had given me more than money. He'd given me freedom. 6 months later, I stood on the deck of my new oceanfront cottage, watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across the Pacific. The sound of waves against the rocks below had become my daily symphony, replacing the familiar creaks and settling sounds of the old house. The cottage in Mendocino was smaller than the family home, but it was entirely mine. Every piece of furniture, every decorative choice, every room reflected my taste rather than compromises made over 32 years of marriage. I'd discovered, to my surprise, that I had excellent taste when nobody else was offering opinions. Henderson Construction continued to thrive under Tom Bradley's management. He called every Friday afternoon to update me on current projects and upcoming contracts, and quarterly profits were deposited directly into my account. I'd kept my promise to maintain the business exactly as Noel had structured it, and everyone involved seemed happier for the stability. The cottage had been an unexpected discovery. While researching properties in coastal California, I'd learned that Noel had purchased it 3 years ago through the construction trust. Margaret Morrison had found the deed while organizing business assets, along with a note in Noel's handwriting, for Myrtle's retirement, when she's ready for ocean air, and no schedule but her own. Even in death, my husband was still taking care of me. This morning was special, though. My lawyer was coming by to finalize the last piece of business from my old life. Wade and Romy had indeed tried to contest the trust arrangements, hiring an expensive attorney who specialized in elder law and financial exploitation cases. It hadn't gone well for them. The investigation had revealed that not only were all of Noel's financial arrangements completely legal and properly executed, but Wade's debt to the business was actually larger than anyone had initially calculated. Interest and penalties brought the total to just over $96,000. The doorbell rang at exactly 10 o'clock. James Patterson, no relation to Helen from the bank, was a precise man who believed punctuality reflected character. He'd been representing me since this whole mess began, and his calm competence had been invaluable during the more stressful moments. "Good morning, Myrtle," he said, settling into the comfortable chair by the window that had become his usual spot during our meetings. "I have the final settlement agreement for your review." I poured coffee from the French press I'd learned to use, another small freedom in my new life, and sat across from him. "How did they take the final terms?" James's expression suggested controlled amusement. "About as well as you'd expect. Wade's attorney spent considerable time arguing that family obligations should supersede business contracts, but ultimately the law is quite clear on debt obligations." He handed me the settlement documents. After 6 months of legal wrangling, Wade and Romy had agreed to terms that acknowledged the full debt and established a payment plan that would take them 8 years to complete, assuming they never missed a payment. "They tried once more to negotiate a family forgiveness clause," James continued. "Wade actually broke down in the final meeting, claiming that you were destroying your relationship with your only son over money. And what did you tell them?" "I reminded them that I was representing your financial interests, not your family relationships. Though I may have mentioned that most mothers don't have to sue their children to collect legitimate debts. The settlement also included a provision that particularly satisfied me. If Wade and Romy defaulted on payments, the business could legally garnish Wade's wages and place liens on any property they purchased. It was a safety net that would ensure I received what was owed, regardless of their future financial decisions. "There's one more thing," James said, pulling out a separate envelope. "This arrived for you yesterday." The envelope was addressed in Wade's familiar handwriting. Inside was a brief note on plain paper. "Mom, I know you probably won't forgive me for fighting you on this, but I wanted you to know that I finally understand what Dad was doing. It took losing almost everything for me to see how much I'd taken for granted. Romy and I are getting marriage counseling, and I'm working 2 jobs to meet the payment schedule. I'm hoping that someday you might be willing to talk to me again. I'm sorry for everything. Wade." I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. The apology was genuine, I could tell, but it was also 6 months too late and motivated by consequences rather than conscience. "Any response you'd like me to convey?" James asked. "No. If Wade wants to rebuild a relationship with me, he can do it the same way he'll pay off his debt. Gradually, consistently, and over time." After James left, I took my coffee out to the deck and read Wade's letter again. The grief was still there, not just for Noel, but for the son I'd thought I'd raised and the family relationships I'd believed were real. But underneath the sadness was something stronger, a deep satisfaction that I'd stood up for myself when it mattered most. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something about it seemed familiar. "Hello? Mrs. Henderson? This is Linda Morrison, Margaret's daughter. I hope you don't mind me calling." I did remember Linda, a nurse who worked at the regional hospital. Margaret had mentioned her occasionally during our meetings. "Of course not, dear. How can I help you?" "Well, it's actually how you might help us. Mom told me about your situation, about how you had to rebuild your life after family difficulties. I'm starting a support group for women who've had to deal with financial manipulation by family members, and I wondered if you might be willing to share your experience." The request caught me off guard. I'm not sure I'd know what to say. "You'd be surprised how many women find themselves in similar situations. Adult children who feel entitled to their parents' assets, spouses who hide financial information, family members who mistake kindness for weakness. Your story could help other women understand their rights and find the courage to protect themselves." I thought about this for a moment, watching a pelican dive for fish in the bay below. 6 months ago, I'd been a grieving widow facing homelessness at the hands of my own son. Today, I was financially independent, living exactly where I wanted to live, accountable to no one but myself. "When would you like me to speak?" I asked. "Really? You'll do it?" "I think I will, but not about revenge or legal battles. I want to talk about the difference between being a loving family member and being a doormat, about the importance of understanding your own financial situation, about the gift Noel gave me when he protected my future, even from our own son." We scheduled the speaking engagement for the following month. After hanging up, I realized that helping other women navigate similar situations felt like a purpose, a way to honor both Noel's protection and my own hard-won independence. That evening, I did something I'd started doing every night since moving to the cottage. I sat on my deck with a glass of wine and watched the sunset, taking time to appreciate the simple fact that this view, this peace, this freedom was entirely mine. No one could take it away from me. No one could vote me out of my own life. No one could decide I was disposable. The cottage was quiet except for the ocean's rhythm and the distant call of seabirds settling in for the night. Tomorrow, I would tend to my garden, maybe drive into town for lunch at the little bistro where the owner always saved me the table by the window. Simple pleasures that belonged entirely to me. Wade's debt would be paid eventually, whether he managed it responsibly or the business had to garnish his wages. The legal settlement ensured that justice would be served regardless of his choices. But the real victory wasn't financial. It was the knowledge that I'd found the strength to demand the respect I deserved. As the last light faded from the sky, I raised my glass in a silent toast to Noel, wherever he was. He'd loved me enough to ensure I'd never be helpless, never be dependent on the mercy of people who saw me as expendable. And he'd loved me enough to make sure that when the test came, I'd have everything I needed to pass it. The ocean continued its eternal conversation with the shore, and I sat in my own home, on my own deck, living my own life, finally understanding what freedom really meant. It meant never again having to beg for a place at a table that should have been mine by right. It meant peace. Now, I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below. And meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites. and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.